Welcome to part three of our Heritage, Our Harbor, um, or rather reversed, Our Harbor, Our Heritage, a four-part exploration of local history. This is part three, Timber, Steamships, and a Harbor Transformed. Again, as I mentioned in previous talks, if you missed part one or part two, or if you're unable to watch this one live, you will get a recording of this, and those recordings only go to registered participants. So if you have anyone who's interested, please ask them to register and we'd be happy to share it with them. My name is Beth Wamagwas. I'm the program coordinator and curator for the Harbor Springs Area Historical Society. I'm thrilled to have you all here for part three, and we are going to go ahead and dive right into it. So, very quick overview. Parts one and parts two have already aired, and those talked about the geological history of our region up through, the fur trade, the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. We moved and jumped from 2 million years in our past up to about 1865, roughly, somewhere in there. And then this is part three, talking about post-Civil War life through 1920. It's a little inaccurate. It might be a little through 1918. We'll see how we get through this. And then part four, coming out in 2 weeks, will cover Prohibition, local cabarets and clubs. We'll talk about the Depression, post-Depression era works progress administration projects, the Michigan Indian Handicraft Project. We'll talk about World War II, the changes in the resort era and the opening of ski resorts and things like that in the 1960s and 1950s. And we'll even work our way up into a little bit more recent history. So, backtracking just a little bit, where we left off last time, it was 1829, and a group of Catholic Odawa had separated from a group that was located in Middle Village, Cross Village, and Goodhart, and they moved to a place they called Weequaton'sing, or Small Bay Place, in 1829 to set up an American style, an Americanized village. And that was the beginning of Harbor Springs, or as we were known for many, many years, Little Traverse. So that's sort of where we left off. We have this small Odawa village that has occasional visits from missionaries and traders. The first major trader who came to the area is Richard Cooper. He establishes a trading post in 1853 in the area. Now, Cooper was originally a fisherman from Beaver Island, but came into Little Traverse and specifically into our harbor to fish here. Now, I found this really fantastic newspaper article that you can see here from 1847. And this is talking about specifically Mackinac Island and the activities that were happening around the island. And it mentioned that we've moved from the fur trade now. And one of the major exports coming from Mackinac Island, rather than being furs, it was fish. So we see here that the industry that is springing up in Little Traverse is also up in Mackinac. And this is just, there's a lot of other fantastic things about this article that I didn't get into. One of them being that as many as 1,000 people a day were already visiting Mackinac Island because ships constantly had to stop and dock there to refuel. And while they were refueling, the guests would get off and wander down the streets of Mackinac City, Mackinac Island, I should say, and visit the many local curiosity shops that were selling Odawa-made souvenirs and that type of thing to travelers. It also goes on to mention the many local bakeries that were already plying their wares to visitors. But this was the coolest part I saw. It's a comparison between how many barrels of fish are going out year to year. So in 1835, there were only 1,700 barrels going out from the area. Now, 10 years later or so, in 1846, there are 20,000 barrels going out. So we can really see that there is a significant increase in the amount of fish going from Mackinac Island. And specifically, this mentions that these fish were packed and shipped from this place, meaning Mackinac Island, and they were taken at Sul Croix, Grand Traverse, Little Traverse, La Croche, and the fishing grounds adjoining. And so that is Cross Village and Little Traverse. So that's our first major industry here in Little Traverse in Harbor Springs. And going along with that fishing industry are the people who make all the barrels that this fish gets shipped in, and those are coopers. So that was what was happening here in our area. Still primarily a small, primarily Odawa settlement. And we get our first post office in 1861. And that's when we're officially known as Little Traverse at that point. Now, I have a few other things. We're moving forward in time now. We talked a little bit in the last session about the Civil War, and we talked about Company K. And so I'll be talking a little bit more about that because it really feeds into some interesting problems that occur in our area. So I also talked about the Indian Removal Act and the various treaties that took place in first 1836 with the Treaty of Washington and then in 1855 with the Second Treaty of Detroit. The treaty in 1855 basically took communal tribal land and broke it up into allotments that individual Odawa men, women, certain dependents, and families could choose an allotment for themselves. This sometimes went to plan, sometimes didn't go to plan. And as I mentioned, following the Treaty of 1836, back, 20 years earlier, many local Odawa were concerned about being removed, and they started purchasing property, actually buying up land. And so this didn't change that. They could still buy up land, but they were also entitled to certain allotments that they could get as well. So one of the things that was part of those treaties were called annuity payments, and many of those actually ended up happening at Little Traverse. So this is a newspaper article from 1869 talking about the Indian payment at Little Traverse. So we learned that at Little Traverse last week, Major Long paid about 2,200 Indians. 12 bands were paid, embracing the Indians of Pine River, which was Charlevoix, Bear River, which is Petoskey, Little Traverse, Middle Village, Cross Village, Sheboygan, Garden Island, Beaver Island, North Shore, Bay de Noc, and Escanaba. The amount of money paid them was $28,000. I did the math, so you don't have to. That's about $1.25 per person, which in today's money is about 30 bucks, about $30 buying power. So those were the some of the annuities that were being released in exchange for giving up millions and millions of acres of land. And it's just fantastic to be able to see this information in newspaper clippings from the time. Another newspaper clipping, much more sadly, is about Lieutenant Garrett Graveret. I always say that slightly wrong. But Graveret was part of Company K, the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters Unit. And that unit was I believe, yes, the largest all-Indian regiment as part of the Union Army. They joined in 1863, and Lieutenant Garrett was one of the main recruiters from the area. And many Odawa and Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe from Harbor Springs, Cross Village, Petoskey all went to fight for the Union. And many of them fought in some pretty intense battles, like the Battle of the Wilderness. Some were sent to the famous, or rather infamous, Andersonville Confederate prison camp. And unfortunately, Lieutenant Garrett here passes away. It mentions that he's a sharpshooter under Colonel Delane, died in hospital recently of wounds received in one of the late battles. His body has been embalmed and will be sent home in October. And what's sort of really brought this home for me is there was actually a letter found that Lieutenant Graveret wrote to his mother, Sophia, from Washington's Armory Hospital. So he writes to her and he says, "On Friday last, during the first charge on the enemy's outworks near Petersburg, I was wounded in the left arm with a minie ball, and the arm had to be amputated below the shoulder." He goes on to say, "I think I shall be discharged before long and come home if my arm does well. The doctor thinks it will do well. Don't be discouraged about me. This fighting for my country is all right." Sadly, 2 weeks later, he does pass away, and his body is returned to Mackinac Island for burial. And why I bring up both of these is because these Odawa who are from Little Traverse and fighting, actively fighting in the Civil War, are not citizens of the United States of America. They are also not citizens of the state of Michigan. And so when they are killed in action or when they come back grievously wounded, when they leave behind widows and things like that, it is difficult for their families to sometimes get pensions or other, benefits that would normally have been paid to a soldier's widow. And this notice on the right here is actually from a session of the probate court and the county of Emmett held in Little Traverse. So right here in Little Traverse, we were the seat of Emmett County, and it talks about how Sophia is coming in to ask to be the beneficiary of the estate of the deceased Garrett Graveray, late of Middle Village. So that was really interesting to find. And directly underneath it, we have a notice that is going to become much more common, and we'll see that later. It says to Alfred Wood, you are hereby notified that complaint has been made to this office that the land entered by you under the Homestead Act, and it goes on to list what land it is, has been abandoned by you for more than 6 months. Basically saying that we're going to come and take your land because you've abandoned it. All of these problems are sort of meshing together to create a very complicated environment for the citizens, particularly the Odawa at Little Traverse at this time, following the Civil War. Now, I mentioned the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act is something that is passed in 1862, and it gives 160 acres of federal land to anyone who never raised arms against the Union. And basically, all you have to do is you have 5 years to put that land to productive use. And of course, the only productive use that is allowed is agriculture, but agriculture in, your typical American European style. And so our area here in Little Traverse, again, because it's extremely complicated, I'm going to break it down a little bit. The Treaty of 1855 breaks up individual allotments on reservation land that had been reserved in exchange for giving away most of the state to certain Odawa. And there's a 20-year limit so that they can choose those allotments and no one else can take that land. Then you have a bunch of other land that has been ceded to the federal government that is now open to homesteaders, and they can claim 160 acres as long as it's not part of that 1855 treaty. And so you do have an influx of settlement beginning after the Civil War of many of these veterans coming up to our area. So it's one of the first waves of active settlement to actually hit the area. Prior to this, we have some traders, we have some missionaries, we have some fishermen, but we don't have very many families. And this is how we get some of our biggest I'll call them outlying communities, I guess. 5 Mile Creek, Stutzmanville, out by Van, Bliss. You get all of these really wonderful small communities that come together, often have their own general stores, their own sawmills, their own churches, their own everything, because they needed to be rather self-sufficient, because at that point it's very difficult to travel to the main town of Little Traverse. On the right is a picture of Abraham Stutzman and his wife Martha and three of their children. And Abraham Stutzman is, of course, the namesake for Stutzmanville, and that's the case with many of these outlying communities and at 5 Mile Creek. Now, again, this gets complicated to say the least, because there is actually a second Homestead Act that is passed more than 10 years later in 1875, because the first act in 1862 doesn't include indigenous communities. So if you were an Odawa or a Métis, a half Odawa, half French, who wasn't technically a part of one of the tribal groups, but you were still living in the area, you weren't entitled to those allotments, but you also couldn't claim a homestead. And so it was a little bit tricky. So there is a later act that allows indigenous families to select homesteads as well. But again, a complication occurs. These allotments that were given in 1855, some government officials, and it depends on the year and how they interpret the treaty, some government officials tax that land, some don't tax that land. It really is very vague. And then you have some fairly corrupt land sales officials down in Traverse City. No shade to Traverse City, but they were not doing some good things. And they were doing it to homesteaders as well as the Odawa community. A homesteader might arrive at his 160 acres up north and find that there was someone else already there. The land office was selling the same parcels of land sort of over and over. Um, then, of course, those homesteads could be abandoned. The Odawa family, perhaps, who was living there, would go away for a few weeks to make maple sugar. They would come back and find a European family on their land, putting it to productive use and saying that it had been abandoned. There were things like back taxes, selling your land for back taxes or for abandonment. And so it was a fairly complicated system going on up here. And so this first rush of settlement is massively complicated. And really, it creates, however, um, a very interesting community because it's a very tight-knit community and many, people pulling together to try to make this work. All right. So we're moving up forward in time a little bit. We're post-Civil War now. We're getting up to the 1870s as many more of these people are beginning to come into the area. And I do have so Jacob Kishik is a local quill artist who has, if you've been following along for these past episodes, done uh, 4 different quill boxes for us already, demonstrating some of the concepts that are happening in the talks themselves. And so he is a tiny bit behind on making the boxes, but he has his designs up here for this series, for part 3. And I wanted to share them with you. And he did a little video, a little voiceover um, that I'm also going to share with you. Hopefully, this is Future Beth popping in to show you a redone video of Jacob's quill work.
Ani Buju, my name is Jacob Kijik. I quill worker in Northern Michigan for 28 years. This is one of my quill box designs that I have coming up. It is a representation of the agricultural and lumber industry in Michigan. So in the foreground, you'll see a plow and an axe crossing each other. And that's just to show the tools at the time, that's how the environment changed for us. And in the foreground, you'll see the quills representing the plowed fields. And then behind them is a fallow field. And then there are workers in the field. So you have 3 workers here. And then there is also a plow worker right over here on this side. And then on the far back, this is to represent the trees as they're coming down. And around the edge, I also included a saw blade scallop to also represent the lumber mills of the area. The second box I have is the Ephraim Shea House. It's to represent the architecture of the time. Ephraim Shea was a renowned inventor for inventing a small locomotive for the lumber industry in northern Michigan. And his house is also made out of steel. So it's rather unique material for that time. And then for my last box on here, I have a steamer. So in the background you see a steamer, and then on the very edge in the front we have one of our G-Mon. And the G-Mon is what we used originally to get goods around the Great Lakes. As times changed, it transitioned into steamers, and the G-Mons were used less often.
It's really neat to be able to see sort of this design process and how Jacob is working on these. So he really sketches it out first and takes the story into account, and then starts this fine, detailed quill work. To describe the scenes, the people working in the background, the agriculture and that sort of thing. So it's been a really fantastic component of this series, and it will continue into part 4 as well. So specifically, and actually the 2 that he talks about that aren't completed yet as well, those I'm going to be talking about later in the presentation. So we'll move on here to after the Homestead Act. Again, many homesteaders are coming up here, and one of the things that they first have to do is clear their land. And so logging starts really picking up. And it's just sort of at this time in the 1880s, late 1870s, that the timber resources of southern Michigan are beginning to disappear. And northern Michigan's lumber boom is beginning. The white pine forests in Pleasant View and Redmond and Friendship and Cross Village townships are calling to these lumbermen. And by 1880, there are a number of sawmills active in Little Traverse. Now, of course, the main sort of Michigan lumber centers aren't up north. They're down in Saginaw and Muskegon and Grand Rapids. For example, in 1871, after the fire that devastates Chicago, most of the lumber rebuilding the city comes from Muskegon. Grand Rapids becomes a furniture center, and of course, the Indian Removal Act, the Homestead Act, that's not limited to Michigan. There are all of these settlers moving out west to places that don't have a lot of trees. And so they need our lumber as well. So these are just a few newspaper clippings from the time. This one from 1886 is from E.L. Marshall. He says, "Look here, farmers. I will pay the highest market price in cash for selected red, white, or yellow birch logs this winter at the toothpick factory." So E.L. Marshall, as he implies here, owns a toothpick making factory that is extremely profitable and does very well in our little town. And logging by this time makes up about 75% of our industry. There's another note from 1887 that mentions that Mr. Parker, another gentleman who's buying up logs, has shipped from this place 955 cords of bark and 2,000 cords of wood and 500,000 board feet of lumber. And he expects before navigation closes to ship quite a bit more, almost double that. So it goes on to talk about that he's also buying up timberland and very interested in that process. The Emmett County Democrat, a local paper from Petoskey, writes in 1877 about W.E. Parker that he is running a general store, but also buying up lumber on the side as sort of a booming business, and does a large amount of shipping wood hemlock bark, which was used in the tanning process, and owned a sawmill at that time. Now, later, W.E. Parker's sawmill is operated by a gentleman named Thomas Neal. And so this is Thomas Neal's mill in an engraving from the Detroit Free Press, actually, from about 1895 or so, but you can see all of the lumber lined up there. And there were quite a few, as I mentioned, other mills in downtown Harbor Springs. It was a big business. There were two in particular that I want to talk about, and they're often extremely easily confused with each other, especially when you just see pictures. But those are the Crowell Lumber Company and the E.G. Carey Hoop Company. So we're starting out with the Carey Company. They start out in 1894. E.G. Carey produces staves and hoops, as the name suggests, for barrel making. And his company eventually reorganizes as the Harbor Springs Lumber Company. So it's another name you might have heard it known by. But it covered a stretch of land from where today's Zoll Street Beach, the dog beach, is, and covered a section from Pennsylvania Avenue down to Bay Street. So you can see here, this is a 1906 Sanborn fire insurance map, and it shows Bay Street one way, and there's Zoll. So it's actually also kind of where the condos are now as well. And these are lanes for finished lumber and logs, and the actual sawmill itself. And the key thing being that it's right on the bay, right on the harbor, so that they can immediately load that lumber onto schooners and have it gone. Now, the Crowell lumber mill operated in the area of what is today's Harbor Springs Deer Park and Ottawa Stadium and the city building, sort of right in there. And so they're really close to each other. That company was founded in 1895, actually by a gentleman named Chapman, but Chapman sells his interest to Crowell in 1903. So it's reorganized and known as the Crowell Lumber Company then after. And this is a picture of that lumber company. So you have raw lumber coming in one side and out the other side, all of these board feet of finished lumber, again, right on the water. Um, I did want to just read this to you quickly. It's talking about E.L. Marshall's toothpick factory, and it's from a local newspaper called the Daily Resorter, and it's talking in 1890 as the factory is still going. It says, E.L. Marshall's toothpick factory is one of the leading industries of this place. Besides affording a home market for sustainable hard and softwood timber, it employs a large force of men and girls during the whole of the year. So it was big business. These are just some fun pictures of logging that I thought I'd include. This specifically is logging near 5 Mile Creek. And this guy up here, I don't know what he's doing, but he looks like he's having a good time. Just kind of perched way up there. So I thought that was kind of a fun picture. And then this is actually Thomas Neal's mill, which was located roughly where the little harbor club is today, sort of in that general vicinity. It's actually said that all of the sawdust from Neal's mill ended up filling Devil's Pond on Harbor Point at one point. Now, of course, we have basically a booming town between the Homestead Act, the lumbering industry, and as we'll talk about in a second, the growing tourism industry that's happening in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. The booming population means that we have a demand for things like public schools. So the Little Traverse School District number one, the graded school, is established. The school building itself is completed in 1877, and it's on the bluff, really close to where today's high school is, right in that area. So this is a picture of that first school, which is just lovely. I think it's beautiful. And this is just a little note from the local newspaper talking about their grades. So you can't hide anything from your parents back then. Now, this picture shows that the school itself needed to expand significantly. Financial statements from the time show that they constructed a bunch of new rooms, they placed outhouses, there was repairs on the school cistern, there were sidewalks being laid and graded, and the final edition, which is this back edition here, is added on in 1905. And if you look closely here at this front building, you can see this lovely little turret and the sort of side stairway. And if we go back, there's that turret and the side stairway. So this school, by 1905, has this final addition on it and is quite large. Of course, eventually even that isn't enough, and they tear this down and in 1915 build the high school that we know and love on the bluff now. So, again, all of these things are happening sort of simultaneously. It's the Victorian era, it's the 1880s, 1890s. Lumber is beginning to dwindle a little bit. And one of the things that's happening in Victorian society at the time is sort of a back to nature movement. So cities are becoming increasingly urbanized, increasingly industrialized. They're just dirty. They're gross to be in. You want to escape them and get back to nature. And when you get back to nature, that is how you become healthy again. There is this strong belief that taking the waters or breathing pure air is actually curative and that it will cure things, not just, small things like hay fever and asthma, but that it will cure tuberculosis. It will cure cancers. And so this sort of back to nature movement is something that the local Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad and other steamship companies really grab a hold of. I kind of liken it to sort of today's Pure Michigan campaign. It's just sort of a similar thing that I find. But these are some examples of bathhouses and things that were taking place at that time. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg is perhaps the best known proprietor of these. He ran the Battle Creek, Michigan Sanitarium. It's the largest sanitarium in the world, where you can have Turkish, Russian, Roman, solar, electric, thermoelectric, and electro-vapor baths of any kind. This is a bathhouse and magnetic spring in Michigan. And then the Water Cure Journal of 18, I think that says 95. So again, there's a renewed interest in health, there's a renewed interest in the natural world, and so places like northern Michigan, which for centuries people have realized is sort of a natural haven, are becoming seen and romanticized as these places of leisure, especially as the lumber industry is kind of winding down. The Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad, for example, and other companies have sunk vast sums of money into the infrastructure required to transport lumber. And instead of losing all of that infrastructure that they've built, they just start carrying people instead of carrying lumber. I really enjoy this quote from a popular essay writer in 1878 that says, I suspect that many of us are, after all, really camping temporarily in civilized conditions, and that going into the wilderness is an escape, longed for, into our natural and preferred state. Now, of course, this sort of juxtaposes with, this desire to escape and be in the wilderness, but they're still in very proper attire, in corsets, you know, very proper. You don't want to escape civilization entirely. You just want to get back to your roots in sort of that way. And this movement, of course, inspires the national park system. So in 1872, President Ulysses Grant designates Yellowstone as our first national park. The second was actually Mackinac Island. That was the second national park, and it was transferred to being a state park in 1895. But again, our area is one of the first recognized national parks. And it might be this wellness craze that is the cause of us changing our name. So Harbor Springs becomes Harbor Springs in 1881. So not everyone agrees with this decision. You can see these newspapers here, and it says, for example, here in March of 1881, the Little Traverse people have, by one unwise act, wiped out the name around which hovers so many memories and traditions by incorporating their town with the name of Harbor Springs. It will be Little Traverse still. A rose by any other name is just as sweet. It goes on to say that after the 18th of this month, the name of Little Traverse Post Office will assume the title of Harbor Springs. So basically, it was to appeal to these new sensibilities. And this very sort of famous picture, I guess it's famous to me because I see it a lot. This sort of famous picture of Harbor Springs is taken around this time. It's taken in about 1875. You can see Holy Childhood Church here, and of course the point out there, the undeveloped point, and the rest of town going off into the distance here. These are just two examples of some of the publications that were coming out at this time. Of course, the explosion of interest in coming to northern Michigan meant people had to get here. And the railroad companies like the Grand Rapids and Indiana and the steamship companies really worked themselves into that system. So this is a pamphlet from 1882 about the fishing line. And the Grand Rapids in Indiana were very clever. They published pamphlets about all of the places to go fishing along their routes, to go golfing around their routes, and really tried to draw people up here. This is a souvenir edition from one of the passenger steamships from 1897, and it is specifically just Little Traverse Bay. So Petoskey, Bayview, Roaring Brook, Weequatonson, Harbor Springs, and Harbor Point, which we'll get to in a second. Now, just around Little Traverse Bay, of course, people need to get around. This is before the railroad reaches us. It is before the advent of the automobile. And so the main way people are getting around Little Traverse Bay is on ferries. The earliest ferries running in our area start in about 1875, and those are run by Christopher Chrysler. Now, I've had this question many times. I do not believe that this Chrysler has any relation to the automobile Chrysler, but I'm not positive. But basically, Chrysler opens a ferry line around this time. Business is absolutely booming. So he buys more and more steamships. Eventually, his son Walter takes over. You can see here, W.E. Chrysler is now the proprietor. And one of the ships, the Walter Chrysler, is named after him. This is a picture of the Adrian steamship about 1895. And these little ferries weren't all that little. They could carry several hundred passengers at a time. And they had fairly complicated schedules just around Little Traverse Bay. And my favorite fact is that by the turn of the century, at the height of these ferry traffic, there are as many as 5,000 people every single day taking these ferries. Just on Little Traverse Bay, just to go from Harbor Springs to Bayview, or from Weequatonson to Harbor Point. That's how many people were riding these ferries. Now, the railroad arrives in Petoskey in about 1875 or so, 1874, and starts running regularly. And Harbor Springs works hard to get a branch of that railway to us. And they provide labor, they provide capital. There's all these discussions at the city council level about how to get the railroad here. And they succeed by 1882. There's a branch that extends all the way from Petoskey up through Harbor Springs and hits our little resort communities and then backtracks and heads up to Mackinac City. Our first depot here in Harbor Springs was actually on a pier that sat out over the water. So you can see it here. In the background, this is Thomas Neal's sawmill, right at the corner where it rounds to go over to Harbor Point. So that's where this is. And it sat very near to the Kensington Hotel, which you can see in this image here. This is the Kensington. And this block is where the New York restaurant is today. That's what we're looking at. So this is now Bay Street. Bar Harbor would be over here, Jewelerette's would have been here, and this is where the New York restaurant is. But this is the Kensington, four-story wooden hotel. And in this ad for the Kensington, you can see the depot out on its little pier and the building itself, and then the train going past. Now, unfortunately, in 1888, it burns down. So this newspaper clipping reads, last night, the telegraph office in the depot, because it was inside the depot at Harbor Springs, was kept open till a late hour receiving election dispatches. Well, this morning about 4 o'clock, a fire broke out therein. The passenger depot, the telegraph office, and the freight depot, the later filled with goods, were all consumed, the loss being total. So it's kind of funny. I don't have a picture of it, but in later ads after 1888, they use this exact same picture, but they've just kind of gently erased the depot from the picture, which I think is sort of hilarious. The pier is still there, and it's used as a pier and a wharf, but the hotel itself is gone. So we are a booming metropolis by, the 1890s or so. More and more people are discovering Harbor Springs, and local residents have worked hard to bring new businesses, new people, the railroad, and everyone to Harbor Springs. By 1882, this is a little newspaper clipping mentioned this. The town itself, so Harbor Springs by 1882 has a drugstore, two grocery stores, two men's clothing stores, a meat market, a bakery, a jewelry store, a boot and shoe store, numerous blacksmiths, liveries, doctors, barbers, lawyers, and two saloons. There are also a lot of hotels in the area, and the lumber industry is still going as a dominant player. This picture I love. This is the Barber Brothers General Store, but it's in the process of being sold to G.C. Adams here in Harbor Springs. So it still says Barber Brothers, but G.C. Adams is now on the windows, so it's in flux. But I love this picture. I just think it's pretty fantastic. Other businesses were also flourishing. This is the Babcock Floral Company. It's one of the earliest and largest florists in our area. It's established in 1903 near the railroad tracks between Weequatonting proper and West Weequaton. And in 1909, the newspaper reports that this operation is the largest flower and vegetable garden in northern Michigan, covering as it does 17 acres of excellent land, besides having a spacious greenhouse with a full line of hothouse plants, which you can see here, they're full line of hothouse plants. As I mentioned, there are many hotels springing up in the area to cater to these visitors, these tourists who are coming up to experience the pure air and clean water. This is one of the first, called the Globe Hotel. The Globe Hotel is roughly in the same location as a previous hotel called the Star Hotel, which is roughly where Johans is today, roughly in that sort of location. The Star Hotel was opened by G.L. Smith in 1875, but by 1883 it's now the Globe. So we don't know if one was torn down and they built the next really close to it, if they just remodeled it. It's a little bit unclear. But basically, eventually, the Globe here is purchased by Holy Childhood and is converted into a dormitory for their male students. This is another early hotel on Bay Street called the Emmett House, which opens in 1876. Again, that time where all of this settlement is happening. George Dickinson is the first owner of the Emmett House. He was also, at one point, the village supervisor, the sheriff, and the county clerk. So he led quite a busy life. Here's another view of the Kensington, which, as I mentioned, was an extremely large hotel. It originally opened as Lake Park House in about 1882 and changed hands many times, changed its names quite a few times. It went from Lake Park House to Kensington to Hotel Dewey throughout the years. Sadly, it only lasts about 18 years before it is hit with a devastating fire in 1899, and it is not rebuilt. But what is rebuilt on that same property about 5 years later is the New York restaurant. Thankfully, it was December when that hotel burned, and so no one was hurt. No one was injured. It was an empty location at the time. But I do love this image. It's a pretty, I mean, if anything tells you that Harbor Springs was doing well, a four-story hotel tells you that. Now, as I mentioned, in about 1875, that is the expiration of the 20-year limit on settlement set in the 1855 treaty. So we are already getting an influx of homesteaders and other permanent settlers in the area, and we're getting tourists all the time. And now we have another category of people coming up here, resorters. So the semi-permanent settlers coming up here to northern Michigan. It begins in 1875 with the construction of Bayview, just outside of Petoskey. They're our first resort community. And this is where I break in and tell you that I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of these communities, but not much, because we have a YouTube page. And on that YouTube page, we have several other recorded lectures that talk specifically about Bayview, about Weequatonson, and about the resort community in general. So I'm going to very quickly just hit some of the highlights so we don't spend all day here. Weequatonson is one of the next that is founded in 1878. And Little Traverse, we were Little Traverse then, not Harbor Springs. Again, we knew the importance of getting people up here and promoting our little slice of heaven up here. And so we actually gifted 80 acres of land east of town to what was then known as the Presbyterian Summer Resort Association. So we gifted this land to them, and the Weequatonson Resort was established. It is known for its beautiful birches, clear creeks, and artesian wells. And just like Bayview initially, many of the earliest visitors were out there camping, just pitching tents until a hotel was built and until they got cottages built and sold the shares in the association. The same year as Weequatonson, 1878, we have the foundation of the Lansing Resort, or Harbor Point Association. It's called the Lansing Resort initially because a small group of businessmen from Lansing visit the site and decide they love it so much they want to purchase it. So, according to some of the early history that's written in this book called A Tranquil Refuge, the story of Harbor Point, that was published for many years in the Harbor Light newspaper before being consolidated into a booklet, um, the Lansing men purchased the property from Father Wycamp, who is an enigmatic gentleman who had originally purchased the land from the local Odawa. So remember I mentioned that the Odawa were purchasing property in an effort to maintain some hold on their homelands. Well, one of the parcels that they owned was Harbor Point, and they sort of reluctantly agreed to sell the land to Father Wycamp because he promised that he was going to be building a convent there, building a school, building a blacksmith shop, bringing in opportunities for the Odawa. But of course, this is a verbal agreement, a handshake agreement. It's not a legal agreement. So when Father Wycamp decides to turn around and sell the property for quite a profit to this group of businessmen, unfortunately, the Odawa have no legal recourse for that. It's a morally sketchy thing to do, but it's not illegal. Father Wycamp takes the profits from his investment on that land when he sells it, and purchases land in Cross Village instead, where he does build a massive compound and convent. Eventually, his property out there has a sawmill and a blacksmith shop and a school and all sorts of things. So Harbor Point gets started. It is an extremely popular resort. By 1880, they hire a landscape architect named John Swift to lay out all of the different paths and where the cottages are going to be and things like that. And they build, as all the resorts did at that time, a clubhouse, a first little hotel for people to stay at before they purchased land. Then, of course, we have Roaring Brook, named for its roaring brook. Um, I think we have more pictures of that Roaring Brook in our collection than almost anything else. I feel like that must be. But Roaring Brook is an association that is officially platted in 1902. The property is purchased back in 1880 by another group of Lansing businessmen. And by 1895, the board has done significant improvements on the property, including carving a bunch of really fantastic walks and paths through the hillside. Now, there are many other resort communities we don't have time to cover. Mononaqua, for example, dates back to, again, the 1870s. It's platted in 1902, and by 1914, it has its own inn. Chippewa Cove is an artist colony founded in 1914 by Ivan Swift. There's Emmett Beach and Forest Beach, and many, many other properties, including Ramona Park, that are active at this time as well. So we're moving forward in time. We um, have quite a few other sort of monumental things happening that I'm not going to cover too much. But for example, in 1886, Emmett County decides it needs a new courthouse, and Harbor Springs wins the bid for constructing it. Petoskey tried to sneak it from us at this point. They don't succeed in 1886. They do succeed in 1902, and the county seat moves to Petoskey. But at this point, we build a brand new building. Um, the builder and contractor is a local man named Charles Caskey, who is best known for building the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island. So he builds our courthouse in 1886, he builds the Grand Hotel in 1887. And the courthouse is really more than a courthouse. For example, this is the fifth annual commencement of Harbor Springs High School taking place at the County Hall in 1891. It's really a hub of community in the town proper. They had operas up here. They had all sorts of entertainments and things happening. And of course, it was the location of the circuit court, the probate court, and that kind of thing. Ephraim Shea arrives on the scene in about 1888. There are many newspaper articles at the time that mention that Shea's coming to Harbor Springs is probably one of the biggest things that spurs its development. And I think that makes a lot of sense. He builds a logging railroad that provides the raw lumber to many of those companies that we talked about earlier, the Crow Lumber Company, the Cary Hoop Factory. He builds the first city waterworks system, which is not only important for having running water in your home, but is the first fire suppression system in Harbor Springs. He actually signs a deal with the city to provide certain water mains and hydrants for fire suppression that come into call fairly frequently. He builds his lovely home, of course, in 1892. These are just a few other pictures of him. This is Ephraim Shea right here, next to one of his home-built locomotives in the area that would come out on this long dock, you can see it right there, and load lumber onto the lumber schooners. So, we're moving into the 20th century. We've gotten there, finally. From 2 million years to the 20th century. And it's a bold new world. The typewriter has been invented. The Wright brothers have their first manned flight. In 1908, the Model T appears, giving us options that aren't just the railroad or steamships. Albert Einstein publishes his theory of relativity, and it's looking like a bright new era. In Harbor Springs, we continue the same trajectory that we've had for the centuries and decades leading up to this. We're growing, town is booming, we have lots of things going on. This is a picture from roughly 1910, I'm gonna say. It's a really beautiful glass plate negative in the collection of the Library of Congress that shows the bank building, and the harbor, of course, Harbor Point in the background. This is the Gardner House right there, you can kind of see, and we're over here just a little bit. You can't quite see us. This is another picture that I love of our town around this era. So, as I mentioned, this is where the Kensington Hotel was located before it burned. And after it burned in 1904, the Leahy brothers opened the New York Hotel and Restaurant right there. And in this postcard image, you can just see the new depot that was constructed after the old one burnt down. You can see its little spire there. And then you can see its spire right here. So what you don't see on this postcard is this boathouse. The boathouse gets its start again about the turn of the century. It starts out with Henry Melching. Melching Boatworks is how that starts out. And I love this picture. I just think it's a fantastic image. Here's another one I love. This is some sort of event happening in downtown Harbor Springs. It's a tug of war down Main Street between these two groups and with all of these young onlookers cheering them on. And there are two iconic buildings in the background that we see today. So the bank building is on the right. The bank was first constructed in 1896. And then the library and post office, it was a post office at the time as well, is finished in about 1908. So this picture is probably about 1910 or so. This is a better shot of the new library slash post office. Again, this is probably around 1910 or so. And it also includes C.B. Lane's pharmacy. So this little spot there, which is now Kelble Pharmacy, and before that was Hovey Pharmacy, and before that was C.B. Lane's Pharmacy. So it's incredible how the function of this building has maintained, remained relatively the same. It's no longer a post office; it's a fudge shop, but the library is still on the second floor there. Now, again, we're going into the 20th century. It's a time of optimism, it's a time of growth, and then suddenly it's a time of deep tragedy. So we're switching gears ever so slightly, and talking about the advent of World War One. So this is a fantastic image from our collection that is it's marked on the back as having belonged to a Nelda Woodruff, and she has labeled it "The Day the Boys Left for World War One in Harbor Springs," which I think is just it's a very moving photograph. So, as many of you are aware, I'm sure, the United States entered World War I in 1917 when Congress declared war on April 6th. They passed the Selective Service Act not that long afterwards. All men between the ages of 21 and 30 had to sign up for the draft. These are examples of two different draft cards from young people from our area. You can see listed Harbor Springs. So this is for Reuben Hildebrandt. He was a clerk, a grocery clerk at the Harbor Springs Grocery Company. And then over here we have Stanley Hoover, who again lives in Harbor Springs, and he is a garden laborer for his father as Hoover Flower Shop. So those are two of them that were signed up for the draft. Now, by the summer of 1918, a year later, American soldiers are arriving in Europe at a rate of 10,000 a day. In total, the US mobilizes over 4 million military personnel during the war, and we lose about 65,000. Here is some more newspaper clippings from the era talking about draft registration days, men who must appear, men who are being called out on active duty and must report for duty, and they have them listed from every sort of location in Emmett County. Um, Not everyone waited for their number to be called. Reuben Hildebrandt of Harbor Springs, it says here, has volunteered to join the colors ahead of his call number and is to be sent to Laurel, Maryland Thursday with 5 other Harbor Springs boys who enter the service as boatsmen. This is Reuben J. Hildebrandt right here, and we're fortunate to have so many fantastic items from him and from his Civil War service not Civil War service, I'm sorry, World War One service, because he gets married and has a daughter. And that daughter is named Eleanor, and Eleanor Muggs Jardine donated them to us. Many of you might have known Muggs. She was a lovely fount of knowledge here and local history. And so this was her father, and he wrote home fairly often. And the local newspaper actually had a section called "Letters from Our Boys," which, due to sort of censorship from the United States government. They couldn't say too much in these letters, of course, for security, but these letters do talk about their experiences. And I find these particularly funny. So, for example, this gentleman writing from France to the pupils of the kindergarten's Petoskey Central School mentions that I would like to tell you all about our life over here, but of course, the most interesting part of our daily work we're not allowed to write about. So I will not be able to say what I would like. But he goes on to talk about how they've received multiple care packages from the Red Cross and from other locations. Now, here in Harbor Springs, we do lose two soldiers killed in active duty. Those are Leo Smith and Stanley Hoover. You can see here the newspaper articles from that time. Both are killed in action in France. This one mentions that Mr. and Mrs. Al Smith, who received an official telegram from Washington last August, stating that their son Leo Smith had been missing from action, received another telegram Tuesday evening that he had been killed. Um, the other one up here is Stanley Hoover, whose draft card we saw earlier. And it says Stanley Hoover makes supreme sacrifice in France. He had been killed in action October 21st. And the Smith Hoover American Legion Post number 281 here in Harbor Springs is named in their honor. So if you've ever wondered where the name Smith Hoover comes from, it is from Leo Smith and Stanley Hoover, both of whom I believe are buried up at Lakeview Cemetery here in Harbor Springs. One of the ways that these soldiers were memorialized comes after the war has ended. There's a two-day event happening in August of 1920 after the war, where Earl Mead, a local architect, designs this memorial fountain, and they call it the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial and Well at Zorn Park. And there are two plaques in set into the walls. The first one immortalizes Leo Smith and Stanley Hoover, and later a plaque for World War II is added on as well, and added on to that memorial. So, we didn't quite get to 1920 because there are two other really important things that happened in 1918 that I didn't quite have time to get to that we'll start part four with. And that is Spanish influenza, which is an extreme outbreak that affects, of course, Harbor Springs, and the devastating fire that occurs in Cross Village in 1918 and wipes out most of it. So we'll start on those sort of low notes, unfortunately, in part four. But then we'll move forward again into Prohibition and talking about gangsters and cabarets and that sort of thing, and moving into the 21st century following that. So I managed to keep it to an hour. Look at that. I wasn't sure I'd be able to do it. But I did keep it to an hour. But if anyone has any questions, I welcome your questions. I'm happy to hear from you if you do have any questions. There is one in the chat that says, "Oh, what is represented next to the hatchet on the quill box?" Oh, that's a great question. Let me scroll back up here. So his design is actually he told me it's a specific type of axe that was used to fell trees here in Michigan, and it got to the point that these axes on these northern trees, this little edge here was constantly chipping off. And so instead of leaving it, people up here started creating specific axes that had that little bit saw shorn down so that it was no longer chipping and breaking. So that's an axe for felling trees, and this is a plow. This is a plow with the lead reins there and the wedge of the plow right there. So felling trees, planting, agriculture is what that represents in the fallow field there. So that's a great question. Did we have any other questions or any other pictures that you wanted me to go back to or anything like that? I'll give you all a few minutes if anyone wants to type anything, if they have any questions. And then, like I said, we'll start part 4 of the series back in 1918. How did they manage snow? That is a great question. And I don't have a picture of it in here. Um, Basically, they had teams of horses, similar to how they would pull a plow to plow a field, except they're using a plow like a snow plow, and you have 6 or 8 horses in front of it, and you plow the streets that way. And then you have a bunch of men out there with shovels. And that's the only sort of solution to managing the snowfall in that era. Um, Horsepower and manpower, pretty much. And most of the trains in the era also had huge snow plows in front of them that allowed them to continue on despite the lovely, you can see on my picture, the lovely winter weather that we have up here. Um, Let me just quickly, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just quickly see if I can pull up that picture um, that shows that. Let me see if I can find it real quick. If I can find it, I'll show it to you. Um, Not in that one. I can't remember which slideshow it's in. I'm sorry. I don't unfortunately think I'm going to be able to show it to you. Um, but let me see here. Um, there we go. Okay. All right. Let's see. Oh, we have some more questions. Um, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again just so you all can see what I'm seeing because it's more fun that way. Here we go. When was the pier built next to the pier restaurant? Um, Very early on. Very, very early on. I actually might have a picture of that. Um, that was built just, oh, I'm trying to think. Basically, it started out as a pier for one of the local lumber companies, the row company dock. But you can see in this picture, this is roughly, here's the depot, and there's already a boathouse here, and there's the beginnings of a pier. So you can see the New York here, and there's the beginnings of, downtown interests occurring. And just, a tiny bit further down, like right here, where it is today, actually. There was a huge dock that was used for the steamships like the Manitou and the Northland to come in and land. And so you can see those in some of these other images, other pictures that I don't have in this slide, but that I could show you. Um, I noticed in the fishing slide the site spelled Mackinac, which today is the spelling of the city. Yeah. Mackinac Island spelled with a W at that time. I am not sure. I think it was very likely that whoever was publishing the newspaper at the time didn't particularly know the difference, and that I'm certain that it was spelled both ways. Um, Between the town and the island. I'm sure it was spelt differently almost every other week, depending on who was setting the type. But I don't think it was officially Mackinac Island with a W, but I think they just sort of printed it that way for that picture. Um, what are our oldest buildings still here? That is a fantastic question. The oldest surviving structure in Harbor Springs is the Andrew J. Blackbird House. It was built sometime around 1858. That is the oldest surviving structure, and it is still here. And it is across the street from where I'm sitting right now, and you can visit that. Some of our other oldest structures are going to be the bank, as I mentioned, the bank and the um, library building. Here we go. You can see those both in here. The bank especially is from, the 1890s. Ephraim Shave's home, 1892. Our building, the Emmett County Courthouse, 1886. We're one of the oldest surviving structures as well here in our building. And the New York, 1904. That's been here a very long time as well. So we can really trace some of our buildings back quite a ways, which is quite impressive. Many towns don't have that sort of continuity with the buildings that have been preserved. The high school's 1915. The Zorn Park Memorial Fountain I just talked about is 1920. So we do have a lot of old buildings, a lot of old structures here. Let me see if I missed any other questions. I don't see any. So I am going to go ahead and say that we will end it there. If you'd like to learn more about any of these subjects, I strongly recommend, again, our YouTube page where I have lots of other pre-recorded lectures talking about a variety of subjects, and you can learn from not just me as a presenter. There's plenty of other presenters on there as well that you can learn from and learn more about the area itself. So I encourage you to visit our YouTube page and welcome you to join us for part 4 that is coming up. I hope you can join us for that. If you haven't registered already, I encourage you to do so. And we will hope to see you all next time. Again, thank you so much for joining us and for your interest and investment in Harbor Springs history. We deeply appreciate your interest in our mission here at the Historical Society. So we will see you all next time. Go ahead and stop sharing my screen. All right. Good night, everybody. Have a good one now.